Okay. Okay. I think we're starting to collect people. People are starting to jump on. So I think, yeah, we can get started, do some intros and things like that, uh, and then kind of get into some of our core topics. Thanks everybody for joining. Um, and Matt, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Absolutely.
So um, we are running this series of podcasts to talk about topics around uh, CHRM, cybersecurity human risk management, but there are many topics that are related to it. And so today we're going to touch a bit more heavily on subjects around quantification of risk, quantification of business case. And this is an area that I have found through multiple discussions with Matt Matt to be quite an expert in and something that I've learned a lot about from him so far. And I think I'll probably learn a few more things even as we talk today. So Matt is a recent CISO. He's now actually a CISO at Cybergence and an advisor and a consultant. And that's probably as far as I'll take it. So maybe Matt, you can introduce yourself before I continue. Um,
Sure. I mean, that's totally accurate. Former CISO doing some virtual CISO type work now and a bunch of other things, risk quantification, training board of directors on cyber risk and other things. So I've got a large palette of things under my belt, but risk quantification is one of the passions that I have, and I think it's one of the most important things for people to focus on. But I'll let you take it from here.
Nice. Thank you, Matt. And again, thanks for taking the time. I'm actually at the Forrester Security Summit today in Baltimore. It's just getting started. I just arrived and actually checked out the keynote right before jumping on this call. Um, one of the hosts, presenters, happened to say up front that risk is one of the most commonly used terms in industry by companies, and probably the least understood. And then, she used that to kind of lead into the fact that risk is something that sometimes can be paralyzing for folks, for organizations, and something that isn't perhaps managed as closely as it could be in some instances. And so, in my role at OutThink as the EVP of Technology Analytics, one of the things that I've been working on quite a lot is human risk management and cybersecurity with the Cybersecurity Human Risk Management Forum. And actually, it was at one of these CHRM forum discussions around the CHRM framework where I had the pleasure of meeting Matt in New York. And he added quite a lot of color to the discussion. So we continued the dialogue. And so now here we are. Um, so Matt, if uh, uh, if we can, I guess, dive in now, like in terms of just quantifying risk, broadly speaking, what's your take? Like, what's the process? What are some of the steps that you would look at? Some of the activities.
Sure. So this is it seems like a very easy question, but the answer is a little more complex. For me,
Mhm.
I first like to understand the context. What is the industry? There's a distinction to take a look at as well. Like there's a lot of reports out there that'll tell you it's cost per record, and they're going to say that's cyber risk. And the reality is when you start to do a deep dive on it, that's simply not a satisfying answer. You can derive a number. If you say, hey, here's how much was lost and here's how much was lost per company, you can divide it by the number of records and get an answer. And it's probably easy for the average person to come up with that and say, okay, here's what the actual risk is. But it doesn't take into account the context. So, for example, when you're breaking down the various areas of risk, you might say, well, you have to have some sort of coverage for the people that are affected by that breach. But it depends. If you're dealing with a 50-person company, it's very different than a 500 million, 1,000-person company. And the
Yeah.
cost to remediate that and the cost of coverage is going to be very different. You might get a few $100s, but it might be for a 50-person company, but far less for a 500,000-person company. So when you're looking at it, that context becomes extraordinarily important. There's a lot of different approaches that you can take to it. There's certain cases if I'm doing like a smaller aggregate version of it, or I might use cost per record because I think that's appropriate in those specific contexts. But there's a lot of places you can go. You can take a look at operational risk. You can take a look at the total cost that a company's using. So let's say their total revenue is, $1 million. Well, great. How much is that per day? So you can start to figure out what is that total risk from a revenue perspective. There's cyber insurance, which is a whole other side of things. Are you going to be hit by ransomware? Ransomware is going to add a whole new things because it covers both operational risk and cyber risk. But then you've got to blend those two in a very specific way to come up with the actual risk is going to be. But there are so many different approaches. And I tend to go with a more approach where you're going to get people involved in the discussion because the whole goal is to change minds. You can't just say, oh, here's a risk, therefore follow it. And if you look at, say, a lot of the cyber insurance aspects that are out there, they're going to tell you, hey, it's a 99 percentile risk or the 99.9 percentile risk. That's going to be $20 million for the risk. And that's just purely hypothetical here. But the reality is it could be much higher than that. Right now, we're working from a United States perspective on a public-private partnership to determine what that maximum risk is going to be. We don't know what that maximum possible loss is going to be for organizations, but we still refer to that as inherent risk, for a lot of people. But that context is a lot more complex when you start to dive into it. So you've got to do some, you got to understand the environment. So if you've got an environment where you've, let's say, $20 million of risk, if you've got two companies that are identical, but one has no security, they don't have firewalls, they don't have email protection, they don't have antivirus, versus a company which is really mature and has all the controls under the sun, well, you know what? The risk is very different. So there's a bit of a process that you have to go to really understand what that large risk is going to be. And so you have to contextualize it based on not only the total risk for the company, but what is the risk after the controls are applied. So, I mean, that's just part of it right there, but that gives you a sense of where I'm going.
Yep. Well, and one of the ways that I've seen folks address risk or break it down, right, is into likelihood of something happening and then the actual impact. And I guess what you're speaking to, well, you kind of covered both points, but you started more with the impact, right? Like what's the cost per something, right? And then, yeah, like the likelihood, I guess if you have poor security controls, then the likelihood is higher and whatnot. But what, so you mentioned a couple of denominators there for impact. Cost per record was one of the options, cost per day, I suppose, or
Yeah,
per
you could
time
break that down
period.
based on revenue. I mean, that's another method you could use.
Okay. What's the, like, is there a preferred model that people use in terms of like cost per, like,
So
is that typical cost per record? Is that a,
I think, and this is because for the last, let's call it a decade or so,
mm,
the information has been out cost per record. We've been seeing that in breach reports. We've been seeing that all over the place. There are large companies that are using that. I think if you're talking about it, that's where most CISOs tend to go, is looking at things from that standpoint. I don't have exact numbers around that. But a lot of us, we grew up. As you mentioned, the likelihood times impact equals risk. And then we have, the likelihood, then we have the impact. And then we have this map that says, great, if the likelihood is very high and the impact is very high, it's going to be critical risk. So we're used to these sort of
right.
matrices. But the real challenge that I find is in many companies, they don't define what do they mean by risk. So are you talking about the cyber risk or that operational risk? So it's a risk to
And
revenue.
what's the difference between the two? You mentioned this before, but I'm not sure if, and I think for the benefit of everybody,
Sure. So
one,
there's a lot that goes into these. And in some definitions, and this is where you have to be very careful, this is not true in other definitions. When you're talking about cyber risk, it's going to look at like the legal work. What's it going to cost from a forensic standpoint to get something up and running, to find out what actually took place? There's a report that's got to go along with that. But there can be legal risks that occur as a result of that. But let's say somebody's information is compromised and you have to monitor their data. Well, that's going to be additional cost. That's considered a cyber risk. So there's a whole bunch of things that go along the cyber risk, and usually you want a gap analysis. How did they get in? What controls are we missing? So there's a whole bunch of stuff. When you talk about operational risk, this is how, if you're looking at it from a business standpoint, typically they're looking at, hey, what happens if our operation goes down? Let's say you've got a cloud hosting company, for example, and let's say you're making $50,000 a day or $100,000 a day, whatever the story is. That's going to show a certain amount of value. That system goes down. What kind of impact is that going to be? What's that operational impact? Can the salespeople do their work anymore? Do you have a call center that's no longer able to make calls? There's a whole bunch of things that can start to tie into those. So you have to be very careful about them, because there's probably depending on how you want to break it down, maybe a 50% overlap between the two. But again, you have to really talk about those things and make sure that you brought that up. So some of the mistakes I made early in my career is not to define the difference between cyber risk and operational risk. So when you define that, then the companies are like, oh, okay, here's the two different types of risk. And then you can kind of aggregate the two together to determine what that risk is. But the ultimate challenge is, you've got to, for me, I like to look at a whole gradational range. And this is true for both cybersecurity risk and it's true for operational risk. At one end, you're going to find what's the maximum possible loss, but what's the minimum expected loss on the other side of the house. And so if you go in there and scream $100 million risk, $100 million risk, what's the likelihood? The likelihood is, depending on what metrics you're using, 1 in 1,000. Are you crying wolf at that particular point? I mean, yes, it's a possible risk, but you can't go in there expecting $100 million cybersecurity program because that's your cyber risk. You've got to combine a lot of these things and have the right discussions. And part of what I do is I bring people on board to make sure that you can match the two together, find out where those risks are, find out where there's a lot of overlap, because there's a lot of overlap depending on the model you're using between operational risk and cyber risk. That makes sense to you? Because there could be legal losses. So let's say you've got to have something up and running. It's a cyber risk. It goes down, but the cloud platform wasn't available, and that's the main source of income. There could be lawsuits that occur as a result of the ransomware. So there's a lot of factors to take into account.
And I guess if I were to summarize my understanding of it, then so there's overlap. It's like a Venn diagram or whatever.
Yeah.
Cyber risk sounds like it could be a little bit bigger than, actually, is that a true statement? Is cyber risk bigger than operational risk in most cases?
So it depends. Again, this is why I don't like to use a one size fits all.
Yeah, neither do we.
A lot of times for some organizations, you take something like the manufacturing sector, which is a very interesting sector. They don't have as many records. They're usually a business to business function because they're manufacturing something for somebody else. Maybe there's a sales arm, maybe there isn't. It depends on what you're talking about. But if there's a B2B, well, you don't have very many records. Cost per record, for example, is not very accurate. The cyber risk could be much lower than what the operational risk is going to be. So this is why I don't like to use blanket terms to say this is going to be higher. Sometimes, quite often, the operational risk is higher than the cyber risk. So when you're talking to business executives and you connect with them, that's what you want to do. And there's other terms too. Like I like to jump into a little bit of the financial side of the house. What do the CFOs look at? They're going to look at value at risk. So there's all these different terms they're going to start to filter in. So when you look at those types of terms, how does that play into the big picture of your risk assessment methodology? And so some of this gets beyond just cyber risk. It's getting into another definition of risk called enterprise risk management. And so tying all these things together under that big umbrella, and underneath the enterprise risk management, for those who are not familiar with it, this is where you're going to start to bring in your legal risks, your human resources risks, operational risks. There's all kinds of things that can start to play into that larger picture. But to me, it's a good place to get started when you're looking at things, because you've got to develop a common language for how everybody's going to be communicating. Not everybody understands cyber risk. They'll have like a vague notion of it, but if you don't define it in the context of the conversation itself, they're in their head, they're going to define it for you. And that's a big challenge, is making sure that everybody's on the same page for how do you communicate that risk.
Yep. That makes sense. So the operational risk is, I guess, if I were to restate it, it's kind of the disruption, the risk or the cost of disruption in your business operations. And then the cyber risk includes some of the other
Sure,
ancillary
sure.
components, I guess, that
Right.
could happen as an after effect of an incident.
Sure.
Um, that makes okay. Um, where is human risk in all of that? How do organizations think about, because like the way we look at human risk in the human risk management industry, right, is the likelihood that the people that comprise the operations of the business could introduce um, uh, some sort of flaw in the system at various levels that could then cause an event. Um, so you have different likelihoods of that, and like in the software development team, like the app dev team, there's different things that they can do to prevent human introduced risks, right? OWASP, whatever. And then you have plain old phishing, right, for all employees, and they can click on something that's bad. How do you think about human risk in the context of maybe ERM or maybe operational risk or cyber risk? Is it even a part of it typically?
Oh, totally. It's part of everything. It's part of the human resources, it's part of legal, it's part of cyber, it's part of operations. It can affect all of these things. So one of the other areas that I didn't really dive into from an operational standpoint is taking a look at business impact assessments. So what I've been talking about so far is kind of the high level, what's that big picture view of the business? But the other side of it are things that's like a business impact analysis. I'm very big on those. Now, I do these for customers. So business impact analysis, I prefer to do a quantified version of that because I think that gets to be a little bit truer understanding. If you're looking for a basic business impact analysis, a lot of them say, well, the risk is low, medium, and high. But what does low, medium, and high actually mean? You've got to define those. That's another place. If you don't define it, they're going to define it for you. And you're not looking at it in terms of the operational risk. You're not looking at it from the cyber risk. Typically speaking, you can go that far within a business impact analysis. Most companies are not looking to go down that particular route, however. But once you understand that business environment, so let's say you've got a particular website and you're losing $20,000 a day, for whatever that site happens to be. Well, then you've got to take a look at what is the relationship of the human risk related to that subsection of your organization. And of course, that's going to change drastically based on the environment, that no controls environment, the no protection environment versus the high protection environment. Those are
Yep.
two completely different things. So when you talk about, say, the risk, say, from an email, from a phishing attempt, which could have some sort of malware behind it, you're clicking on a website that could, cause malware. And some of these worst case scenarios, I think a lot of people aren't aware of. I mean, I'm going to give an example I heard at a conference probably 10, 15 years ago, something like that. But it was a piece of malware that came down, infected one machine, went back up to Dropbox, pulled down another piece of malware, infected another machine, and did this till it infected the entire company. Almost the entire company, minus a couple of machines, were wiped and redone from scratch. But they
Wow.
found after they redid it, the whole environment, it was up again the next day. The viruses came in because they didn't block Dropbox and they still had some residual component in there. And so
Mm.
that was a huge issue for the organization. Now, this was a big presentation. The FBI was presenting all this information that was out there. But when you start to look at human risk, this could be somebody clicking on a link. But if the real risk is around clicking on that specific link, you've got some bigger issues to go on. You don't have good secure email gateways. You aren't checking to see what's going outbound or inbound. You don't have firewalls. There's a ton of things that can go on. A well-prepared company is probably going to handle that and not even notice it. They won't even yawn at it because it's just going to be part of the background noise of the organization. But a company that's unprepared, this could completely wipe them out. So the risk is going to be extraordinarily different, both from that likelihood and that impact. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of different risk equations you can throw in from impact perspective, but that should just give you some context of how human risk management can play into things. You've got to understand the business context, because if you don't understand the business context, then you're not going to know how to communicate that risk. You're not going to understand what the risk is for that organization. You can get some general high-level generalities, but you can't really understand what the risk is for the organization.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's I guess you have to be able to draw a line between different types of human initiated events and your
Totally.
operations. And and uh, and is so from in terms of business impact analysis as a process as I guess one of the processes that it sounds like that you would use to quantify risk. What uh, who's involved in that? Is that something that you just kind of walk around the organization and do as a consultant, or is that, like, how does that work? Or is it a tabletop sort of exercise where people come together and figure out what business processes could be at risk? What is that?
So every organization is a little bit different. If you want to look at by the numbers, the Science Institute, for example, said that typically the IT team runs the business impact analysis. Security does this
Okay.
sometimes. To me, the business impact analysis is really important for both the IT teams and the security teams, because you need to, like, so for example, if you're doing a disaster recovery plan, you're trying to figure out what is your priority. It should be based on the business impact. And so that prioritization is part of that. So you can start to tier all these different applications. Is this a tier 0 versus a tier 3? Well, your response is going to be different. Maybe you need to have them specifically set up. But what happens in those worst case scenarios where, let's say, a cloud environment is hit and you've got 15 different types of systems that are up there in the cloud, that whole cloud is down. Where do you focus your efforts? So there's got to be some sort of prioritization. Now, you might be in a larger organization. You might have one team focusing on one, another team focusing on another, so you could do everything in parallel. But generally speaking, you need some sort of prioritization mechanism for an organization and trying to figure out how that goes. But that's where I would start to tie in that BIA is such a critical part of it. But I do that. To me, the best thing to do is start getting in line with what the business thinks. What is the chief financial officer thinking? How do they approach it? And I think that's really important, because then you're starting to get an ally. Okay, you get the CFO on board with it. Hey, this is going to impact this. Maybe you want to talk to your chief revenue officer. Well, how much money are we making with this particular service versus this service? And so
Mhm.
there's also going to be some cases where the stuff is intertwined. You might say, well, we have this, so this adds to this. And so it's not always a clean number. But at least if you could start to get into, say, a conservative and a liberal estimate, that's fine. Like, there was a study out by the insurance organization, and I completely believe this, that a lot of SMBs, for example, completely misjudge the amount of time it's going to take for them to recover from an incident by a factor of 4. And I
Mm.
believe that, and the same thing is going to be true for large organizations. How many large organizations have had their entire environment wiped out all at once and having to restart from scratch? Very few. This just doesn't happen very
It's
often
not
unless there's
frequent.
a major event. So it does happen, but it's not a common occurrence. It's not
Right.
something that people do on a day-by-day basis.
Right.
So who gets involved? It's going to depend on it, but that's something that I do is try to figure out who those allies are and start to build that case.
Is it fair to say that IT teams would have, like in an enterprise, right, would have sort of a mapping between um, applications and business processes or something like that? Like where the business analysts know that, okay, this application serves this process, that process, this much revenue, or this kind of, so there may be some sort of um, starting point in
You
most,
hope so. It
yeah.
depends on the organization. Some organizations that's very tight, and what you're describing absolutely is what's going on. But there's a lot of cost with trying to stay up to date with all of this stuff. And not all businesses are perfect at it. I've worked with a lot of
Right.
businesses where they just have never done one before, or maybe they haven't been focusing on the right areas, or, maybe they got part of it done, but they haven't done this, fully in a long time. But also there are other factors you can take in. So what's the tail of a risk? Let's take Change Healthcare. Change Healthcare really was a wake-up call for a lot of companies in so many different ways. Like I'm aware of a CISO in New York, for example. He was not happy that it happened, but because he was trying to say, we need a backup for Change Healthcare, we need a plan in case they're not available because they're a critical service.
Single point of failure.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that you totally single point of failure. You're 100% right. And so you've got to look at what's the tail. So it might not be an impact for if it's an hour loss, but maybe what do you do after a day, a week, a month, and so that tail is going to start going up. Maybe it's your company's out of business, which is what happened as a result of Change Healthcare. A lot of companies just couldn't afford to do that. A lot of them could, but a lot of them couldn't, and they're out of business just as a result of Change Healthcare. So understanding where that business risk is going to be absolutely critical, not only to the quantification process, but your ability to communicate. If you know that it's specifically related to this service, and this is one of our critical services, here's our tier 0 services. And if one of them goes down, it's going to be a major impact. Well, you're going to be able to communicate much better. But most BIAs, though, are going to be, what's the risk? Minimal, low, moderate, high, critical at best. A lot of them are just low, moderate, and high. And they don't really understand or have communicated what the risk is. And you got unbeknownst, and I've lived this. So I've made these mistakes, I've learned it, and I've built upon that and have done better as a result of having made mistakes in the past. But, if you don't cover what that tail is, you don't cover what a lot of that stuff is about, you're not going to have as good of a risk assessment if you don't understand the environment. Because the whole goal from my standpoint is, how do you make organizational change? When you're doing organizational change, it's about being able to communicate in business terms that everybody understands. So talking about terminology, talking about what are the key critical things that the business cares about is really critical. And this is part of determining things like risk tolerance and risk appetite, and trying to factor in, how does this play into these different types of risks? And are you getting into confidentiality, integrity, and availability? A lot of companies like to use reputation, but I've even seen things like customer service. How will this impact customer service? And so that's the same thing. You get CIA and customer service, and that's perfectly okay. The business has the right to say that. We are here in service of the business to help them make better decisions. And also it's required, like a lot of cyber insurance, for example, these days, a couple of clients that I've worked on from a BIA perspective are looking at things from a cyber insurance and, hey, we need to have this in order to get better insurance. Can you help us build a BIA? And absolutely. Tell me what you need, and we can go from there. So all of this stuff starts to play into the big picture, and then you can factor in all those cybersecurity controls and what are your backup plans and things like that that go into really understanding what that risk is for an organization. It's not just snap your fingers, hey, let's just slap on some insurance risks and hey, we're off to the races. It's a lot more complex than that.
One more question on risk quantification before we move on to some of the business case related questions. And
Sure.
by the way, for those of us that are on the session with us, thank you for joining, and feel free to throw comments in and we'll address them as we go. But how often do you see quantification of likelihood, and what are likelihood of an event, right? And what, like, is there a sort of threshold likelihood that people look at as being sort of in that critical risk or high risk category? Like, if I were to build a risk model, is 99% likelihood something that you would see frequently, or is it 99.9? Is it 95? What are
So,
some of the numbers that you typically see?
so the question, I think, is a little bit wrong because it's incomplete.
Okay.
So for example, if you get something called an Nmap scan, and be slightly technical for some of the people here. So basically think of it as just a scan. Like in one organization, we would see, I don't know, 100,000 of these a month. Is that a critical risk? I don't think it's a critical risk. It's just background noise. For some organizations, it's going to be, millions of these a month. So does it matter? The amount may matter if it gets to the point where it's a denial of service attack, but that number is kind of an arbitrary number for some organizations. Getting attacked every minute of every day is par for the course for many organizations. Now, that's not always true, but when you consider things like a lot of small and medium businesses from a ransomware perspective, 1 out of 3 organizations typically has a ransomware event. And that's where you can start to say, well, okay, let's take a look at the context. How are you protecting yourself? Do you have firewalls? Do you have a next generation antivirus in place? There's all kinds of things. But one of the things that I like in looking at the big picture is the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm going to work with version 1.1. I know 2.0 well, because I'm doing assessments even right now related to that. I've got a report to turn in today. But you've got to identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. A lot of companies really focus on that protection. Oh, if we protect it, we don't need to do anything else. Well, what are you protecting? How are you protecting it? How do you know if you're compromised? Are you detecting those? Do you have a security operations center that's going to find out if there are issues going on in your organization? That's going to be part of that big picture when you're starting to look at things. And when you're looking at risk, for example, one of the challenges to look at is you have to take a look at the size of the organization. A risk of somebody clicking on a bad email are very different in a 3-person organization than they are in a 1,000-person organization. The chances are much higher. So you've got to factor in all of those things when you're looking at the business. Maybe some people aren't looking at their emails all day. Maybe they look at it once a day or once every, a couple hours. It just depends on the organization, how it's set up, what are the key things, what are the mistakes people are making, and also, are the controls actually too tight? You get things too tight, people are going to find a way to work around the controls. And so they're going to find other loopholes to get their work done. So risk is complex, but there are definitely some things that you can do to start to analyze that and put a picture together of what the real risk is for the organization.
That's cool. That's Well, and I think some of the things that you mentioned lead us into sort of a discussion about incidents potentially, like an Nmap scan and um, things like that, right? And some organizations having many incidents and some having very few, and I guess having different baselines of how many incidents you're expecting to have. Um, is So when we talk about putting together business case for, and we've sort of touched on this already a little bit in the discussion, but putting a business case together for some sort of security program or a new security tool or some sort of initiative, to secure the organization. Um, does incident quantification factor into a business case like that typically, or?
I think so. For example, let's take something very simple. A secure email gateway. What they do, there's a whole bunch of things. I'm going to simplify for purpose of the discussions here, but basically they filter out the bad stuff. If something's coming through with a bad URL, some of them are going to check the moment you click on the link. It puts a filter in place to say, is it bad or is it good at that moment? That's going to start to change things. So when you're looking at this, when you're trying to define the incidents, you have to really understand what that is. So is it an incident that you got a phishing? Yeah, but you have to take a look at the type of incident. Is it a false positive, a false negative, true positive, true negative? There's some false positives. There are benign true positives. So that's something else. Like, yeah, somebody was doing something, but it's really not a serious incident. And so there's a lot of those things like that you have to take into account, and you would start to define it in some of those cases. But to go back to the secure email gateway, if you're able to, for example, you're trying to create your business case and you've got 50,000 emails coming through and you block that, you might say, well, look, let's create a general number, and you can come up and agree with it with the CFO or some others, try to figure this out. But let's say you were going to save somebody an hour a day by filtering out junk email or bad email. Well, that's quantifiable. How much time is your security team actually focusing on remediating incidents that are coming through? So that's a quantifiable number too. So you can start to take a look at the types of incidents, the amount of effort that people are putting in, and start to say, look, we need a secure email gateway. Here's why we need it. We need to improve because of X, Y, and Z. And then you could say, great, we're able to save ourselves on average $100,000 just as a result of doing this filtering. And that's a very good business case. And also you could talk about the risk reduction. It's going to reduce the human risk because you've got that part of it covered. You're going to be saving time and money from everybody. And all of these things are going to ultimately build the program. And sometimes using the operational side of the house is a more effective argument than the cybersecurity side of the house, because that's what the business oftentimes cares about more than the cyber risk, right or wrong.
Hmm.
So I do like to take into account a lot of these things, because if your whole company's going down on a regular basis, then you've got some larger issues that you've got to work out as a company. And so
Oh, for
there's
sure.
a lot of factors. A lot of the teams are running around. Eventually, the IT team is going to want to put some controls in place to prevent these things from happening in the future. There's going to be lessons learned. The approach that I like to take is and I think you hit it on the head, let's develop a program. Let's use some sort of standard that's out there where you're covering all the controls. Because the reality is, like, I'm touching on one basic control here, email, but
Hmm.
everything together ends up relating to one another. If you've got an intrusion detection system from a network standpoint, well, that's going to be helpful too. So if you get an email that's coming in, you've got no antivirus, at least you're blocking at the network level, because with the intrusion detection system, maybe or maybe not. So you
Right.
have to have everything working together in concert to really understand that big picture from a cyber perspective.
Right. Right. Yeah. Defense in depth and different
Yeah,
layers and
yeah.
whatnot. So, um, so components of the business case, typically, I guess, and you kind of talked through some of them, and I'm just going to feed some of these back at from what you said. So time saved for users, potentially, right?
Potentially,
Like
yeah.
with the email gateway example, time saved for the security team could be a component of the business case. And then various risk calculations and operational disruption. How do you, so time saved, you can turn that into money by multiplying by some sort of loaded FTE cost or whatever. Um, how do you dollarize the risk piece of a business case, or do you? Uh,
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you have the data, you understand what the overarching risk is for the organization, that's going to be part of it. And sometimes you're going to tie it into an aggregate. Sometimes you're going to say, look, we don't have the exact numbers, because the reality is any type of risk assessment, it's always going to be some estimation that's involved.
mhm.
One of the phrases that I am slowly becoming famous for in that is, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. What you need is buy-in
Yeah,
both from your possible board of directors or your executives or the other executives that are out there to say, hey, here's what we're looking at from a risk standpoint. Sometimes you're going to tie it into compliance. Look, this is standard compliance. I often will say, look, this is a foundational control. You've got to encrypt your databases. It's just kind of one of those one-on-one things, because if you don't do it, you look like a fish out of water if a incident were to take place, and that could amplify what the impact is. And also it makes it easier for an attacker to be able to pull that data right off of a system without having to compromise a user account if they get inside. So you've got to take a look at all these different things. There's going to be some assumptions that go into that. I read a lot of different breach reports and used to looking at the data in order to create a pretty good case around it, but not everybody's going to be diving in that deep in that level of detail. The other thing too, you can factor in, hey, this is one of the questions that we get for our cyber insurance. This is going to help reduce our premiums. So implementing cybersecurity is going to have a lot of value from that standpoint. The other side of the house to look at, and this is where you start to get value in cybersecurity, because I'm very big on that. How do you generate value? So value, some of the ways we've talked about, but the other side of it, the third-party risk. A lot of times companies are expecting, and it depends on the industry. I've been in cases where this has not been true, but a lot of times when you talk about third-party risk, companies are demanding that you get that risk in place and that you're identifying what it is. So once you do that, that can start to change the game for the business, because the business starts to see you as a value generator and not purely as a cost center. So there's a lot that can go into that, but I find that to be a very valuable exercise, because you've got to highlight, hey, we're security. Here's what we're doing for you. And so that becomes part of that whole quantification that you're bringing into place. And even when you're working with a lot of statistics, you can't get this statistic through most of the mechanisms that are out there, but it's one of the things that I do. I can demonstrate that value to your business as a result of doing risk assessments and diving into some of the details and looking at quantified business impact analysis and some of these other things to ultimately drive that business case. In the end, when you start to pull in all of this information, you've got a much better business case to work with. And there's always quirky things that you're going to find. Every business is going to want a different way to do a business case, and what are your justifications and things like that. But those are some of the centralized themes. You need it for this. It's going to be risk reduction. It's going to save employees time. All of these different types of things can be part of it. Some business cases are going to want to say, well, how long is it going to take to implement? What is our operational cost? So you do a cost benefit analysis, and say, what's the cost versus the benefit, and is it really worthwhile? In some cases you don't know. Like in that example case where I had the company that had no security controls, anything is going to be a huge value. But the more and more you get, there's a little bit less value. But usually at the smaller orgs, you've got less value to protect, with a lot of exceptions. I know companies out there with millions and millions of records, and that starts to change the whole conversation too, because you can have a very small company with millions of records, and that's a whole nother can of worms. So as I said, you've got to understand the context of the business. What are they doing? What's the environment? Is the operational risk or the cyber risk? Sometimes that cyber risk is higher than the operational risk. So you just have to understand, where is the money coming and how are they getting their money? What's the business model, and so on.
Are there any benchmarks that you've seen with regard to incident statistics and breaches? Like if I'm, and I don't know what, so let's say if I have 5,000 employees and a certain number of customer records, certain number of transactions that I process, I don't know, like what would be the sort of metrics to which you might benchmark how many incidents I should be having? And is it fair to say that, like, if I have more incidents, then that means I have higher likelihood of a breach, or that's not a causal relationship?
So there's a few questions, if you don't mind me kind of breaking that
It's
down,
a lot in there.
that you're diving into. I mean, are there breach statistics? The challenge is we've got too many breach statistics that are out there. Every company, or a lot of companies, are developing breach statistics. The question is, which ones do you really trust? Because a lot of them are going to focus on this, or what does their company do, and they're collecting data related to that.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about, like, one of the companies I really like from a breach statistic perspective is Verizon. And one of the reasons is they've got the Verizon data breach investigation report coming out for many years. And just for full disclosure, I used to work there, so I know some of the people there, et cetera. I still run into them upon occasion. But the data is really solid because they're aggregating it from around the world. Is it complete information? No, it isn't, but it's a decent source of information. Now, if you're looking at the cost per record related to specific controls, that one is very tough. You do have stuff that's out there, like you'll find the, cost per record, they're out there with various companies, but the challenge is you don't find that sort of data. It's all done by companies like myself. I mean, there's simplistic data that's out there that's being used by other companies, but that's part of what I do, is I try to match and take some of that data that's out there, understand the environments, understanding what the risks are related to the environments, understanding, like, I'm a big fan of key performance indicators. What are really the risks related to key performance indicators, and trying to factor in what that whole context is, because that changes the whole game when you're starting to look at these things. So there's definitely some statistics, but you've got to take a look at them in context and factor it. Now, I don't mind doing, like, hey, you want a copper, not even a bronze level assessment? Sure, I can do that for you, and I can help out. What is the value that you're going to get out of doing a cybersecurity program? What's the maximum potential you can have? I think the quote you guys put me on was it's for every dollar invested, you get $8 of value back. And so that number is realistic for many companies. For some companies, that's not going to be realistic. Some it's going to be much higher, some it's going to be much lower. It depends on what company, what they're going to be doing. But generally speaking, cybersecurity does pay for itself, and it's something that I believe that companies should be investing in across the board.
Is there and we're kind of running into the time allotted. Actually, we run over by 1 minute, but just to um, follow up on that $8 statistic, is there kind of like a hurdle rate that you typically recommend when someone's looking at a ROI, a business case, an investment case for a security program? Um, should I look for something that's at least $8 per dollar invested, $5 per dollar invested,
So
$3?
if you even get to that point, you are ahead of probably 99% of the companies that are out there. Um,
Okay.
so I mean, it's like kind of icing on the cake when I start to mention things like that. But I
Okay.
think that it is something that is very valuable because you can pull that in. For some companies, especially if third-party risk is a huge deal and you're working with data, I can tell you your company basically becomes invaluable. You are an extension of the sales teams with third-party risk because you go in, you get those assessments, you have the assessments done on you, you do it on them, and you've got all of this stuff, and they're wanting to check
Yeah.
every single box from a third-party risk perspective. You basically have enabled, in some cases, 70, 80% of the business. So how do you put a number on that? You talk to your chief revenue officer, your chief
That's fair.
financial officer, and you come up with something that's going to be ballpark true. Now, again, it's not true across all organizations, but it's a really
Mhm.
good thing to get. But I would say it depends on the organization. I don't like to throw in numbers when you've got companies that are one person companies all the way through, hundreds of
Well,
thousands of people. Some of them are 400 or 500,000 people in a company. The risk profile is very different.
and probably the one-person company is not going to do such a sophisticated
Yeah,
analysis.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Going to be more gut feel. Um, so, okay, well, good, good. Then I guess, uh, well, we're kind of a couple minutes over, but to tie it back to human risk management, um, I guess in terms of the business case for human risk management, what would be some of the areas that you would look for um, to kind of build a business case to better manage human risk?
A whole bunch of them. It just depends on the context. I'm just working on a case study for one of the programs that I have within Cybergence, but I was talking about that 25 is trying it was 25.6 million, but 25 million loss that it was
Hmm.
related to the Hong Kong company, the Hong Kong police had talked about.
Oh
That's a
yeah,
human risk. That should be a process change. You know, the person who is affected by it obviously bought all of the deep fakes and the AI and things like that. So, you know what? Maybe you need additional validation that you need to put in place. That doesn't mean you need to purchase a tool, but you know what? Let's create a validation process
process.
before
Yeah,
sending out $25 million.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you have to take a look at everything on a case by case basis. Since not everything is going to be expensive, it might be like, okay, jump through this additional step. So I like to take a look at the context because human risk is everywhere.
Hmm.
You talked a little bit about the software development side of the house. So how do you mitigate that? You have, somebody else looking at the code. You've got SAS, DAS, SCA, all these different tools that you can start to bring in. And that's extraordinarily valuable too, to say, hey, here's some ways we can mitigate that risk. Just do some validations and checks and get pen testing done and all the different types of things that you talk about are going to be an important part of that process. I mean, there's
Yeah,
a reason why, and I know one of the big areas in cyber today is around zero trust. How are you doing a zero trust assessment of your organization, and how does that fit into the risk posture? And that can start to really inform. If you get a really good zero trust assessment, what that risk is ultimately going to be from a human risk perspective.
hmm. All right. Well, that sounds good, and probably a good place to close this discussion. So really, again, appreciate your time, Matt, and the conversation around risk and quantification. Um, and we're going to be putting this up in our podcast section
Sure.
and putting it out there. So um, thanks for those of you who are on with us. We didn't get any questions or comments this time, but still a lot of content that we went through. So really appreciate it.
Thank you so
And
much.
yes, and have a good rest of the day. And good luck with finishing that report today.
No, thank you so much.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Take care.